On a bright July morning in Miami Beach, Gianni Versace stepped out of his mansion and walked toward a small cafe he visited almost every day. There was no crowd, no red carpet, no warning that anything was about to change. Minutes later, 2 gunshots echoed down Ocean Drive, and one of the most powerful figures in global fashion lay dying on the steps of his own home. How could a man surrounded by wealth, fame, and beauty be so exposed in his final moments? Why did this ordinary routine end in an extraordinary act of violence? And why, decades later, do questions still linger about who was truly being hunted that morning, and what forces had been set in motion long before the trigger was pulled? This is not just the story of how Gianni Versace died. It is the story of the hours, the patterns, and the missed signals that led to that moment. By slowing time down to its final ticking seconds, and then tracing backward through the weeks, the years, and the shadows behind the glamour, we begin to ask the question that still refuses to settle: what really happened in Gianni Versace's final hours? The news spread across the world in minutes. Television networks broke into regular programming. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Fashion houses went silent, then flooded the airwaves with statements of disbelief. Gianni Versace was dead, shot outside his Miami mansion in broad daylight, at the height of his influence. For many, the words felt unreal, as if they belonged to a movie script rather than a police report. In Milan, models and designers gathered in stunned silence outside the Versace headquarters. In Paris, editors who had just spoken to him days earlier replayed his last interviews, searching for signs they might have missed. In New York, buyers and celebrities asked the same question over and over again: how could this happen to him, here, like this? The shock was not only about loss. It was about rupture. Versace was not a fading star or a troubled recluse. He was an active force, shaping fashion, culture, and celebrity itself. His death shattered the assumption that success and visibility offered protection. If someone like Gianni Versace could be gunned down on his own doorstep, then no amount of money, art, or status seemed to guarantee safety. Almost immediately, the narrative split into competing currents. One focused on grief and legacy, celebrating the men who transformed Italian fashion into a global spectacle of color, sexuality, and power. The other turned toward fear and confusion, demanding answers from law enforcement. Who would dare assassinate such a figure? Was this a targeted hit, a random act, or something far more complex? As reporters descended on Miami Beach, Ocean Drive transformed from a postcard of leisure into a crime scene broadcast around the globe. Yellow tape fluttered where photographers once waited for celebrities. The marble steps of Casa Casuarina, usually bathed in sun and admiration, became a symbol of vulnerability. This was no longer just a personal tragedy. It was a cultural earthquake, one that forced the world to confront the unsettling idea that the final hours of a global icon could pass unnoticed, unprotected, and fatally exposed. To understand why Gianni Versace's final hours struck the world so deeply, it is necessary to step backward in time, long before Miami, long before Casa Casuarina, to a childhood shaped by fabric, discipline, and quiet ambition. Gianni Versace was born in southern Italy, in Reggio Calabria, a place far removed from the fashion capitals that would later orbit around his name. His earliest memories were not of runways or cameras, but of his mother's dressmaking shop, where needles moved with precision and garments were built piece by piece, never rushed. From a young age, Versace learned that beauty was something constructed, not accidental. He watched women transform when they put on a finished dress, saw how posture changed, how confidence appeared where uncertainty once lived. That observation would follow him for the rest of his life. Fashion, for Versace, was never just clothing. It was power, identity, armor. When he moved north to Milan, the city that would define his career, he arrived as an outsider with an unorthodox vision. Italian fashion at the time leaned toward restraint and elegance. Versace brought something more confrontational. His designs were loud, sensual, unapologetic. Gold chains, sharp cuts, bold prints. He rejected subtlety in favor of presence. And the world noticed. Success came quickly, but it came with pressure. As his brand expanded globally, Versace became more than a designer. He became a symbol of excess, confidence, and provocation. Celebrities wore his creations not just to look beautiful, but to make statements. Runway shows turned into spectacles. The line between art, commerce, and celebrity blurred until it nearly disappeared. Publicly, Versace appeared fearless. Interviews showed him uncomfortable with attention, certain of his vision, proud of his legacy. Privately, those close to him would later describe a more complicated figure. A perfectionist. A man deeply sensitive to criticism. Someone who carried the weight of his empire personally, absorbing every risk and expectation as if it were his alone. As the years passed, success hardened into routine. The shows continued. The accolades accumulated. But behind the carefully curated image, cracks began to form. Health challenges emerged. Trust became more selective. Security became a consideration, though not always a visible one. Versace had reached a level of fame where anonymity was no longer possible, yet he still clung to habits that belonged to a simpler time. That tension between global icon and private individual would quietly shape the final chapter of his life. The very qualities that made him magnetic, accessible, and human would also leave him exposed. And as the clock moved closer to that July morning in Miami, the distance between his public triumphs and his personal vulnerability grew thinner, setting the stage for a tragedy no one yet understood was approaching. By the mid-1990s, Gianni Versace was living at the intersection of triumph and strain. From the outside, his world appeared unstoppable. The brand was global. The revenue enormous. The influence unmatched. Yet inside that success, there were pressures that never appeared on magazine covers. Versace had survived cancer years earlier, an experience that left a lasting psychological mark. According to people close to him, the illness changed how he viewed time and control. He became more guarded, more aware of mortality, yet paradoxically more determined to live without visible fear. Recovery did not bring peace. It brought urgency. He worked relentlessly, pushing himself through schedules that left little room for rest. There were also tensions inside the empire he had built. Creative disagreements, financial complexities, and the constant demand to innovate weighed heavily on him. Versace was not a designer who delegated his vision easily. He trusted few people completely. Every collection felt personal. Every criticism felt intimate. The brand did not merely represent his work. It represented him. At the same time, Versace lived openly in a world that was not always welcoming. His sexuality, though never hidden, existed under a microscope in a media landscape still deeply uncomfortable with it. Tabloids speculated. Rumors circulated. Privacy became increasingly fragile. For a man whose design celebrated exposure and confidence, the scrutiny could be suffocating. Miami offered an escape, or at least the illusion of one. Casa Casuarina was not just a mansion. It was a sanctuary. A place where Versace could step away from European fashion politics and live with fewer layers between himself and the world. He walked. He sat in cafes. He repeated routines that felt grounding, even as his fame made them risky. What few realized at the time was that another life, running on a darker track, was moving toward an irreversible collision with his own. While Versace navigated health concerns, creative pressure, and the weight of his name, Andrew Cunanan was already on a violent path across the United States. His actions, at first disconnected in the public eye, would later be linked into a grim pattern. The tragedy of Versace's death is not that it arrived without warning in the abstract. It is that the warnings belonged to separate worlds. The fashion world was focused inward, on shows, markets, and image. Law enforcement was chasing a fugitive whose face had not yet become familiar to the average citizen. And Versace himself continued to live as though the boundaries between safety and exposure could be managed by instinct and habit. This was not a single moment of failure. It was a slow convergence of vulnerability, routine, and a threat that remained invisible until it was too late. And as summer deepened in Miami, the distance between those converging lines shrank, unnoticed by almost everyone involved. The final 24 hours of Gianni Versace's life unfolded without spectacle. According to reports, the night before his death was quiet. Casa Casuarina stood illuminated against the Miami darkness, its gates closed, its interior calm. There were no parties, no crowds, no urgent phone calls that would later be dissected for hidden meaning. Versace went to bed expecting another morning like the many before it. As dawn broke over Miami Beach, the city eased into its familiar rhythm. Ocean Drive filled slowly with joggers, cafe workers, delivery trucks. Inside the mansion, Versace prepared to leave, dressed simply, without the theatrical flair the world associated with his name. He did not request an escort. He did not alter his route. What is clear is that he intended to follow the same routine he had followed countless times. Shortly before mid-morning, he stepped out onto the street and began the short walk toward the cafe. Witnesses later recalled nothing unusual in his demeanor. He walked alone, unhurried, blending momentarily into the flow of the city. For a man whose presence usually commanded attention, these minutes passed almost invisibly. What is known from police reports is that Andrew Cunanan was already nearby. How long he had been there remains a matter of reconstruction rather than certainty. Some accounts suggest he waited. Others indicate he moved with purpose, closing distance once Versace turned back toward his home. What is clear is that their paths converged on the steps of Casa Casuarina. Versace had just returned from buying newspapers. He reached the gate, keys in hand. In that instant, time compressed. 2 shots were fired at close range. The sound cut through the street, sharp and final. Versace collapsed on the marble steps, mortally wounded. Emergency services were called within moments. Bystanders gathered, confused, horrified. Paramedics arrived quickly, but the injuries were catastrophic. Gianni Versace was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. There were no recorded final words. No last gestures captured for history. Only the abrupt ending of a life that had seemed untouchable. The entire sequence lasted seconds. Yet those seconds would be replayed endlessly in headlines, court documents, and documentaries, each attempt trying to stretch time long enough to make sense of what had just happened. A global icon had been killed in the most exposed place possible, at the threshold of his own home. As the street was sealed off and the mansion transformed into a crime scene, the reality settled in. The routine that had once represented freedom had become the pathway to his death. And the final hours that preceded it, so quiet and unremarkable, now felt unbearably heavy with meaning. In the hours following Gianni Versace's death, Miami Beach became the center of a global investigation. Police cordoned off Ocean Drive. Detectives moved through Casa Casuarina, photographing marble steps still stained with blood, cataloging fragments of evidence that suddenly carried enormous symbolic weight. The crime itself was brutally simple, but its implications were anything but. Within days, authorities identified the suspected gunman as Andrew Cunanan, a man already wanted for a string of murders across the United States. The narrative shifted from shock to pursuit. How had a fugitive linked to multiple killings managed to remain at large long enough to strike one of the most famous designers in the world? Why had warnings failed to translate into prevention? As details about Cunanan emerged, public fascination intensified. He was portrayed as intelligent, manipulative, and deeply unstable, a man who drifted between identities and social circles. Media outlets began to examine his past obsessively, looking for any thread that might explain why Gianni Versace had become his final target. Rumors circulated about prior connections, secret meetings, shared social spaces. Some were fueled by speculation. Others were flatly denied. No definitive evidence ever established a personal relationship between the two men. 8 days after the shooting, the manhunt ended abruptly. Cunanan was found dead by suicide on a nearby houseboat, using the same gun believed to have killed Versace. With his death, the possibility of direct answers vanished. Motive, intent, and planning were left to inference rather than confession. For many, the case closed legally, but not emotionally. The absence of a trial created a vacuum. Into that space rushed theories and arguments. Some saw the killing as a random collision between fame and madness. Others believed it was a deliberate act driven by obsession, resentment, or a desire for notoriety. Questions lingered about missed intelligence, about whether Cunanan could have been intercepted sooner, about whether Versace's visibility made him a symbolic target rather than a personal one. For Versace's family and colleagues, the aftermath was lived privately, even as the world dissected every angle publicly. Grief unfolded under scrutiny. Statements were weighed for meaning. Silence was interpreted as secrecy. The investigation's official conclusions did little to quiet the unease. Too many uncertainties remained, frozen in place by the death of the only person who could have explained his actions. In the end, the case left behind a familiar discomfort. The facts were sufficient for a report, but insufficient for closure. The world knew how Gianni Versace died, but not fully why. And that unresolved question ensured that his final moments would never belong solely to history. They would remain open, debated, and haunting. In the months and years that followed, the world tried to move forward, but Gianni Versace's presence never truly faded. His fashion house survived, reshaped by those who knew him best, carrying his name into a future he would never see. Runways continued. Dresses were worn. The Medusa emblem remained unmistakable. Yet everything existed in the shadow of that morning in Miami, as if time had split into before and after. Versace left behind more than a brand. He changed how fashion spoke to power, sexuality, and confidence. He blurred the line between designer and celebrity, turning clothing into performance and identity into spectacle. He gave artists, musicians, and models a visual language that celebrated excess without apology. That legacy still echoes every time fashion dares to be bold instead of polite. But when his life is viewed through the lens of his final hours, another truth emerges. Behind the glamour was a man who valued routine, familiarity, and moments of ordinary freedom. A man who believed that walking alone, buying a newspaper, and returning home unguarded were small acts of humanity worth preserving, even in a world that had made him larger than life. His death reminds us that vulnerability does not disappear with success. That fame can illuminate, but it can also expose. And that the habits we cling to for comfort can sometimes become the very places where danger finds us. Gianni Versace's final moments were brief, sudden, and public. But the life that led to them was complex, creative, and deeply human. By slowing time down to those last hours, we are not just revisiting a crime. We are confronting the fragile line between who the world thinks someone is and who they are when no one is watching. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind on the steps of Casa Casuarina. Even icons live their final hours as human beings, unaware that the ordinary morning ahead will become the moment the world remembers forever.